Greetings and welcome back to Podtalk. I'm Melanie, and we are joined together here to grow generous hearts. And in this podcast, we have some who have been at that work, both in their own individual lives and in the lives of their communities. Welcome back, Pastor Bob from Holy Cross in Libertyville, Pastor Peter, retired from Prince of Peace in Schaumburg, Pastor Stefan and Pam here from Christus Victor in Elk Grove Village. Great that we can be together again. Pam, I know that you help out at the food pantry. I was wondering how that is going.
It's going beautifully. One of the things I wanted to share with you all about that is about one of our volunteers her name is Mary, and she has the greatest gift of hospitality. I'm there with her. I'm service. I'll stack shelves. I'll fill bags. Mary is the most gracious host. She welcomes everyone. She knows their stories. They tell her everything. They miss her when she's not there. She makes our food pantry an incredibly welcoming place. And in addition to her service, it is really her gift of hospitality that has made the food pantry such a warm and welcoming place. I'm really proud and honored to serve with her when she does that.
Cool. What a great example of abundance within the hospitality realm, not necessarily giving of things and stuff and in our household, but for our own person. Yeah. So remember, Podtalk is only the beginning, but we want to hear your stories. So we've been hearing about some friends of ours and people that are doing generous things of abundance in our neighborhoods, but we want to hear your stories. We want to hear about how your conversations are going with each other, with your friends, what you're thinking about as you go about your days, what discussions or how these discussions may be influencing what you're doing at your work, and how you're discovering abundance in your missional community small groups. So remember, go on cvlutheran.org/generoushearts to submit your story, because we want to know how you all are growing generosity in your corners of the world. So today, our text is 1 Timothy 6, only 3 verses. We're really packing a punch with verses 17 to 19. It gets at the whole goal of this podcast, to live a life that really is life. What do we do with our wealth? What relationships do we have with the gifts that we've been given? What relationships do we have with the people with whom we connect with? Who or what is our true treasure? The kids in Sunday school this morning came out with a pouch with a penny in it. And I asked one of the parents, what is that? And apparently the mother said, apparently this is where they talked about Jesus as our true treasure. It's great when people come back to church and find out the very lessons of faith, right? You could say that it's about the good fight of faith, what Pastor Peter said last session, where we're giving way for our tendencies to find worth in our wealth and hold so tightly onto that which we have, thinking that we're not going to receive that back or have enough. It's about sharing our wealth and our table with all. So first comment today, I think we're going to hear it from Bob. Pastor Bob, take it away.
Thank you, Melanie. I appreciate stories, Pam, like you shared at the beginning, because I think it gets at this Timothy text in a very significant way. It's the idea of how we model our lives based upon the values that we have. And I think when you begin to look at Scripture and you begin to think about what it can do for us and help us to navigate through life, I think sometimes it's amazing to me how spot on it can be. It can speak to us in a way that we need to hear on a daily basis, and to be able to do that. It's interesting that 1 Timothy is kind of part of a trilogy. There's 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and actually Titus. And those 3 in the biblical scholarship, they are considered to be pastoral epistles. And it's kind of fascinating that oftentimes we attribute their authorship to St. Paul. A lot of biblical scholars will say that 1 Timothy was probably written by Paul, potentially when he was imprisoned in Rome or right before he was imprisoned, and probably somewhere in that 65 to 70 AD in that time frame. So there was a lot that was going on. Timothy was in Ephesus. And he was there working with that faith community, and to be able to do that. What's interesting, though, is that sometimes when we think about the scriptures and where they come from and who wrote them, it is, when you look at this, it speaks again to what Timothy was all about, and that was that there were these false teachings and heresies that were beginning to be put out there. And as a result of that, Paul, or one of his students, represented his thoughts and his theology and wanted to encourage Timothy to deal with these heresies, these untruths, these misinformation, if you will, kind of to use a more contemporary term today. And what's fascinating is that 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy and Titus was included in the New Testament during the canonization process, which for many of us, we may ask, where did the Bible come from and how did it get put together? And it was probably in the 4th century that the New Testament as we know it was assembled. And they used certain benchmarks. And for example, a lot of the, like Hebrews and Romans and Timothy and Thessalonians and so forth, they attached it to authorship, and it was supposed to be Paul that wrote these letters and so forth. So you have Paul writing to Timothy to encourage him. What's kind of fascinating about this is that Timothy was pretty young, and you may or may not know this, but his name is referenced in other New Testament books. So for example, you'll hear about Timothy in Acts and in Romans, in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st Thessalonians, Philemon, and Hebrews, which says something, doesn't it? The fact that Timothy was known in this way. So there was something going on in his life. And part of what was going on in his life was those that were nurturing him and mentoring him. So one of the things that we know, his mother was Eunice, and his grandmother was Lois. And they are referred to, the reason we know this, in 2 Timothy. And those two women really encouraged Timothy and brought him up in the faith and began to encourage him to explore what it meant to follow in the ways of Christ, of Jesus. So I think one of the things, again, Pam, like you were saying, we look for those people in our lives that maybe are models for us and how they can help us to begin to put together what it is that we say we believe and how we want to practice our lives and begin to look at that. Now, there is a couple of other interesting things. Timothy probably would be characterized as the first of second generation Christians. So Christianity was just in the, developing, not the way we think of it, and church wasn't the way we think of it. There were faith communities, people gathering together, and in Ephesus there was a group of faithful people trying to figure things out. One of the things that Timothy quickly learned is church is messy. And I guess maybe still today we're all kind of nodding our heads going, amen. When you're in life together, it gets messy. There's an old African proverb that says, if you wish to go fast through life, you go alone. If you wish to go far, you go together. And I think one of the things that Timothy was figuring out was what it meant to go far, which is to be mature and to, continue to grow in your faith and so forth. What's interesting, though, is that when Paul, let's assume Paul wrote this, when Paul was encouraging Timothy, he was giving him some very practical instructions, some ways of handling the pressures and the challenges that he was dealing with in Ephesus. And some of those issues were as follows. There was the false teachings, as I mentioned, the heresies, and a lot of that had to do with understanding who Jesus was, his humanity, his divinity, his teachings, and all of those things. There was a lot of people extrapolating and drawing conclusions about how they were supposed to behave and how they were to treat one another. And so Timothy was being encouraged to take a look at things like, how do you worship, public worship? What's that supposed to look like? And what's the idea of gathering us together? Another one was the importance of prayer. Another one was the matter of good order, administration, to be able to bring some intentionality, some thoughtfulness. Leadership was another issue. Qualifications, some very practical matters. There is a section in 1 Timothy that talks about gender roles and expectations and the role of women and men and what it means to be a leader in those days and what it means for us to be today. And you begin to put all this together, and Melanie, as you said, there was also this idea of some of the practical things like finances, money. And I think besides in 1 Timothy, the reality is if you look in the New Testament, one of the topics that Jesus talked a lot about was money and our attitude towards it. It was more our attitude towards it and the presence that it has. So when you begin to put this all together, we begin to get an idea that there was a lot going on. And actually, there still is a lot of relevancy, I think, from 1 Timothy. So I just want to pull this together and say that I think that in 1 Timothy, for example, there is this idea, or it left me with this feeling that what Paul was trying to do for Timothy was to invite him to aspire to be a person of faith and to live that faith out in community, to recognize that it's about diverse individuals. And that's still true today, right, in our churches, hopefully. It's the idea of how do we support one another, food pantries, for example. It's the idea of living as recipients of God's grace. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between maybe a world's view of grace and God's view of grace and what that looks like. And then it's also this idea of how do we really love someone, love each other. And I know if you, at Holy Cross, people get tired of me saying this, but I actually think loving someone is one of the hardest things for us to ever do. To love each other the way I think Jesus wants us to love each other. So when you begin to think, 1 Timothy gives us some inspiration and helps us to think about how can we be more intentional, more thoughtful, right? That's what he was encouraging Timothy to do, to be more thoughtful and intentional, to be generous, to be followers of Jesus, to nurture hope, to cultivate joy, to promote peace, in our relationships, Melanie, like you were saying, and that purpose of something beyond just ourselves. And so when we look at these 3 verses in the 6th chapter, it's that idea of, sometimes we have this idea of where we're going to put our trust. And Timothy's being reminded and reminding us to not put our trust necessarily in the uncertainties of wealth, but rather to make those investments in each other and to be able to do that. So it's a pastoral epistle, and it's incredibly relevant, I think. And this is where I open it up for conversation, but I think for me, it's the idea that I think this is a great example of how we can wade into difficult conversations. And God knows there's plenty of opportunities for that today, right? To have difficult conversations, things around what does it mean for us to practice agency when it comes to social justice and generosity. It's the idea about authority and where we place our trust and in whom we put our trust. It's the idea of who's included and who's excluded. And I know, Stefan, you mentioned last time about, communion, Holy Communion, the Lord's table. And so there's so many ways that we can do things to influence how we live our lives. So I would just open it up and give us a chance to kind of think about some of the things. Maybe this has spurred some thoughts. And Pam, you look like you're ready to.
I can jump.
I was just
Okay.
going to say, this is a lot of
There's
lot of hard stuff.
And 3 verses, and there's a lot there.
Just love.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's hard.
Should we just read the 3 verses because they're so short? Is that okay?
Yeah, I've got it right here.
Maybe you.
Yeah. As for those who in the present age are rich, command them not to be haughty or to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but rather place it on God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. They are to do good to be rich in good works, generous and ready to share, thus storing up for themselves the treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of the life that really is life.
Okay. So the phrase, one of the phrases that you used was in talking a little bit about grace and understanding grace, and the church in community being a little messy. And one of the things that has been kind of troubling me a little bit lately has been what I feel like is sort of a popularization of the term grace and giving grace, and sort of in doing that, kind of cheapening it, where grace, as I understand it, a Christian form of grace, is a very costly thing. And my sense is that as I hear people using it as a substitute for, don't worry, no big deal, you know, I'll give you a pass, you can make it right next time, or something like that, as opposed to what I feel like you're better to discuss than I am, and clarify, but that grace, it's grace, which is so important to us, it's important to us as Lutherans and as Christians, is way more than just giving people a pass, right? It is how we are forgiven and members of a Christian family, and are free, basically, based on Christ dying for us, right? That's a very expensive gift, and I don't like seeing it cheapened as it is sort of morphed into the general lexicon.
I'm intrigued by how do we share this grace and not holding it back, and share this expensive grace that is given to us by Christ. And Bonhoeffer constantly in his writings reminded us how important it is not cheap grace, but the grace of Christ when he gave his life for us, and how important that is to claim that and refer that to Christ. And so for us here at the church, it is very important that we are inclusive, and that we are invite people who are from different places, and we are blessed to have people who come from many different places and feel welcome here. And so I'm very touched by what happened during our car show throughout the summer, where we made friends, and then all of a sudden a person announced to me several times whenever we had a car show, I'm coming to church, I'm coming to church. And I thought, oh, you're welcome, you're welcome. Did I believe he would come? To be honest, I heard that many times. And then he showed up. And then he showed up with his wife. And then I said, well, this is one time. Okay, fine, he's checking us out. Well, he came again and again. And then we share grace when we share communion. And everyone is welcome to come forward. Well, he came forward. He never had communion before in his life, so he didn't take communion because he didn't know what it is, and he didn't feel like he's invited. Even we said, everyone is welcome. And then he talked to Pastor Melanie several times and about communion, and he said, I take my time. I'm learning, and then a few weeks ago, he opened his hands for the first time and see what will they give me. And he got the bread of Christ, and he got the blood of Christ, and he felt so good. He felt like, I'm at the table now. I'm welcome now. Now I'm in. It took time, and it was not cheap grace for him. This was very special. So when things like this happen, I realize that God is at work, and God is teaching us what grace is and how we as people need to be reminded and be welcoming and open for that. Peter, what do you think about grace and receiving grace and
I'm thinking about God's call to a generous life. And that might take us a little bit off of the theology of grace, but I strongly support Pam's question here. A great issue that you raised. There was an incident in my life, and if this might take us a couple minutes over, but just ask everybody's indulgence. I was 10 years old. So this was 1962. Out shopping with my parents in a shopping center, open-air shopping center. They said, we'll meet you back here, fine. And as I looked around on the ground, there was lying a $5 bill. Nobody in the crowd seemed to be looking around for anything that they had lost, so I picked it up, put it in my pocket. Went home, showed it to my parents. They said, oh, that's nice. You're not going to keep it. And now, 1962, if you multiply, use the inflation calculator, that's $50 now. So they didn't want me to just take it and use it however. So they said, we think you should donate it to some cause. But we want you to choose the cause. So we'll help you kind of think of some ideas. Well, I don't know how much time passed, it wasn't long, but we were all listening to the radio one morning, and they were interviewing the person in charge of Jane Addams' Hull House, University of Illinois Chicago campus. Jane Addams was a great social reformer of 100 or more years ago. She now has a tollway named after her. The important thing to know is she worked among the poor, the immigrant, the homeless, orphans, and she started a movement. And the Hull House, which was an historic place, was being renovated in the 1960s. And so my dad said, well, maybe you want to send your money there. This sounds interesting. I thought, yeah, that does sound interesting. So I sent it in and didn't think anything else of it. But a couple of weeks later, a letter arrives in the mail addressed to Mr. Peter Hellstedt. I open it, Dear Mr. Hellstedt, thank you for your generous donation to the Hull House at UIC campus. And went on and told me what fine work they are doing. And then it concluded by saying, we hope that when the project is concluded, you and your colleagues will come to visit us
10.
so we can show you the extent of the work that we're doing. And I kept that letter for years. I wish I still had it, but I kept that letter for years because it helped me to realize somebody appreciated what I did. And I became part of something bigger than myself. And we talk about, well, to take hold of the life that really is life. I wouldn't have understood that then. My parents wouldn't have put those words to it. But I really think that's part of what God is calling us to do, to realize that in generosity, combined with the efforts of others, we can accomplish so much. So that's just my little take on Timothy today. Thanks for letting me share the story.
Yeah, that was a great story. Yeah, I think that logically grace is very difficult. And I've had people in the congregation say, I don't get it. I don't get it. I don't get it. And these are people that I see as being grace-filled and living fully into God's word and love. And I don't think it's just a movement of intellect. I think it's a really grasping hold of kind of what we're talking about. Like, I'm all in, God. I'm yours, every single part of me. And that is not easy. And that is involves a lot of things like you were talking about, Timothy brings up for us. But I also think that that the Bible is very relevant in so many ways. And so hopefully we're doing that here in Podtalk, where we can literally spur each other to act out what the Bible is asking us to be and who to be and how to be. So if you're an individual listening today, or if in your small groups, or if you are on your morning walk, or maybe you're running and you've got your phone going, cooking dinner, there's so much more that can be said. We could sit here forever and talk about this stuff. But you can access the reflection questions on cvlutheran.org/generous hearts. It's also not too late to join a missional community group or to start your own, where you'll find others on that same page with which you can talk. But here we go on this generosity journey to influence the world. Thank you for today, and see you next time on Podtalk.